But I remember this time George got caned, George Harrison, because we were mates at school. And I mean, we never really did anything wrong, but we might have like tight trousers and Ted hairdos, and so that pointed you out as somebody as a troublemaker.
Without him.
Have you been able to have any reconciliation with Paul since that particular event?
Oh, he's okay, yeah. He's okay. He just was trying to use that situation for some personal motive that he had, and it just didn't work.
Paul McCartney has been hailed as the most successful songwriter of all time. Together with John Lennon, he created the legendary Lennon-McCartney duo, who penned hundreds of timeless songs that became immortal classics in the history of world music. Yet, behind the dazzling glory of the Beatles, the relationship between McCartney and George Harrison, the band's gifted guitarist, was far from harmonious. Paul himself once candidly admitted in an interview that their conflicts had grown so intense that George actually walked out. For many years, the two could not reconcile, and the root of it all stemmed from one mistaken decision made by Paul, a misstep that ultimately contributed to pushing the legendary band toward collapse. So, what truly happened between them? And in the end, how did Paul McCartney attempt to salvage a relationship that seemed impossible to repair? Paul McCartney went through a childhood filled with turbulence. His father earned a living selling cotton while his mother worked as a nurse and was also the main pillar of the family. However, when Paul was only 14 years old, his mother passed away from breast cancer. That tragedy not only stole away the peaceful innocence of Paul's youth, but also cast a dark shadow over the entire family. Later in life, during many interviews, Paul still choked up as he admitted, "My music came from my mother." And the song Let It Be stands as the clearest proof. He recounted that the title came from a dream in which his mother appeared and gently told him, "Let it be." Those words of comfort became a guiding light, helping Paul move through the pain of loss and leading him to embrace music as a way to heal. Paul first started learning to play with a cheap guitar that his father had bought for him. But the path was not easy. He was left-handed, while the guitar was made for right-handed players. Because of that, Paul had to restring the guitar upside down and practice patiently, note by note. What seemed like an obstacle eventually became a unique distinction, helping to shape the unmistakable style of Paul McCartney. Then destiny arrived one day in 1957 when Paul met John Lennon at a small church performance. At that moment, John's magnetic presence and confident demeanor made it impossible for Paul to look away. After just a few short exchanges, they both realized a shared spark, a burning passion for music. With the keen instincts of an artist, John immediately recognized Paul's talent and invited him to join the group. From then on, their first songs were born, laying the foundation for what would become the legend of the Beatles. Not long after, another crucial piece of the puzzle appeared: George Harrison. Paul met George during bus rides to school. Both of them went on to study at the Liverpool Institute after taking the 11+ exam. Yet their personalities were completely different. Paul was a diligent student who kept himself away from trouble, while George was rebellious and regarded school as nothing more than hell on earth. Although dismissed by teachers as useless, George possessed a natural gift with the guitar. He could mimic complicated riffs just by listening to them on the radio, earning admiration from his peers. Paul quickly noticed this talent and decided to introduce George to John. At first, John was hesitant. Could a 14-year-old boy really be good enough to play with them? But a makeshift audition on the upper deck of a bus changed everything. George picked up his guitar and played the entire song. Raunchy with such skillful precision that John had no choice but to nod in approval. From that moment on, George officially became a member of the Quarrymen. But the transformation went far beyond that. The group was no longer just an amateur band playing for fun. It had now formed a creative triangle bursting with energy between John, Paul, and George. They moved beyond simply covering popular hits and began writing songs of their own. From those modest beginnings, a phenomenon called the Beatles gradually took shape, one that would forever change the history of music. However, their collaboration was not always smooth, because behind the dazzling spotlight, friendship could not always remain intact. Few people know that it was precisely the disagreements over songwriting that caused Paul McCartney and George Harrison to endure a long period of conflict, leaving behind cracks that were extremely difficult to mend. In 1967, the Beatles released the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This was not only a creative breakthrough, but also marked a significant turning point in the relationships among the members. Before that, John Lennon had always been regarded as the soul of the group. But by the time Sgt. Pepper came out, the balance of power had begun to shift. Paul McCartney was gradually stepping into the role of leader. George, the youngest member of the band, carried with him a constant desire to be recognized as a true songwriter. After years of being just the guitarist, he began writing more and more songs, and in fact produced some that were of remarkable quality, such as Within You Without You, Sgt. Pepper, 1967. Yet in Paul's eyes, George's compositions were still not on par with the works of Lennon-McCartney. Inside the studio, Paul often revealed his perfectionist nature. He did not hesitate to dictate in detail how everyone should play their instruments, even George, who already had his own distinct style. This left George feeling disrespected. At times, his frustration boiled over and he snapped bluntly, "You pick up the guitar and play it, and I'll show you how to play the drums." In 1967, when Brian Epstein, their close manager and also the spiritual anchor of the Beatles, suddenly passed away, the band was left disoriented. In that moment, Paul McCartney attempted to take the helm, suggesting the Project Magical Mystery Tour. However, the work received heavy criticism, making the atmosphere within the group even more strained. George, on the other hand, grew increasingly disheartened, feeling like an outsider dragged into plans he did not truly believe in. By 1968, during the recording of the White Album, the conflicts finally erupted. Paul's relentless perfectionism drove him to continually demand that George play the guitar exactly as he envisioned. George, suffocated and resentful, felt crushed under the weight of control. After one particularly heated argument in the studio, George walked out. Although he eventually returned, the fracture in his friendship with Paul was undeniable. From then on, George slowly distanced himself from Paul and sought empathy elsewhere. One of the few who truly understood and respected his music was Eric Clapton. Clapton even contributed guitar to the track, "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," as if to affirm that George did not need Paul's validation to prove his talent. The rift between Paul and George became even more pronounced in 1968 when the Beatles traveled to India together to study transcendental meditation under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This trip had originally been initiated by George, who was deeply fascinated with Eastern philosophy and yearning for spiritual enlightenment. However, not everyone in the group shared the same ideals. While George immersed himself in meditation, the other members, especially Paul, lacked focus. Paul kept drawing everyone back into discussions about the next album. George, already carrying the weight of being undervalued this time, firmly refused and made it clear, "We came here to meditate, not to talk business." George no longer wished to be swept into Paul's ambitious schemes. For him, music was not merely a tool to climb higher, but something inseparably bound to spirituality and liberation. Even after the trip to India, tensions did not subside. In 1969, when Paul proposed withdrawing from Apple Records, the company they had all founded together as a shared home, George strongly objected. To him, it felt like a betrayal of the original ideals they had once embraced. Those disagreements, coupled with his ongoing sense of being ignored in his role as a songwriter, deepened the rift between Paul and George. While Paul increasingly became the one steering the Beatles' ship according to his own vision, George felt more and more like nothing but an unwilling passenger. It was not until 1969, with the release of the final album Abbey Road, that George Harrison's songwriting talent was finally acknowledged in a truly deserving way. Two of his songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something, quickly became timeless classics, leaving a powerful mark on the history of music. Even John Lennon himself had to admit Something is the best song on the album. Yet, that recognition came far too late. For many years prior, George had been forced to live under the enormous shadow of Lennon-McCartney time, and again, seeing his own compositions rejected or diminished. The frustration built up within him until it finally erupted during a bitter exchange later recalled in the biography Paul McCartney many years from now. When Paul reluctantly admitted, "Now this year, your songs are at least as good as ours," George shot back bluntly, "That's a myth. Most of the songs this year I wrote last year, or even before that. Maybe now I just don't care whether you like them or not. I just make them." The conflict between Paul and George was not simply about ego or authority, but rooted in a deep clash of musical philosophy. Paul was famously perfectionist to the point of obsession. He constantly sought to control every detail in the studio. More than once, he dictated exactly how George should finger chords, play notes, or even shape melodies to fit his vision. For George, this was no different than having his hands tied. An artist burning with creative passion found himself watching as his ideas were smothered beneath Paul's dominance. The more time passed, the more George felt he was no longer a true musician, but merely a shadow obeying commands. In a 1974 interview, George candidly revealed, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney." With all respect to Paul, he is a great bass player, but sometimes he's just too overpowering. "I would join a band with John Lennon any day, but I could never join a band with Paul McCartney. It's not personal, it's a musical thing." That statement was the outburst of years spent suppressed beneath the Lennon-McCartney shadow. George Harrison had stopped waiting for validation from his bandmates. He knew he had his own voice and a distinct musical soul. And even if it meant leaving behind the empire of the Beatles, he was ready, because for George, creative freedom mattered more than glory. As for Paul McCartney, he always held a particular fondness for George Harrison, often calling him little brother. He frequently reminisced about the beautiful memories of the Beatles, but also candidly admitted that their relationship had fractured since the late 1960s. Paul made several attempts to repair it, especially during post-Beatles meetings and the Anthology project. Yet he himself acknowledged George was not always easy to work with, revealing just how deeply those differences had taken root to the point where reconciliation was never fully possible. Their story stands as clear proof of how unrecognized talent, excessive control, and the longing for independence can break apart even the greatest of bands. But the journey did not end there. After the Beatles dissolved, the individual paths of George and Paul opened a new chapter, one filled with unexpected turns in both their music and their complicated relationship with each other. George and Paul, after leaving the Beatles. When the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, George Harrison finally had the chance to step out from under the immense shadow of John and Paul. During his time with the band, he had usually been limited to contributing only 2 or 3 songs per album. Therefore, once he gained creative freedom, George immediately unleashed the full force of the energy that had been suppressed for so long. That same year, 1970, George released his solo album, All Things Must Pass, a triple album that included songs he had originally brought to the Beatles, but which had been rejected. The album was an instant triumph, propelled by the hit single My Sweet Lord, which became the first solo song by a Beatle to reach #1 on the Billboard charts. Critics hailed All Things Must Pass as powerful proof that George Harrison had never been merely the quiet Beatle. This was the moment he emerged into the light as a true songwriter and major artist. Melody Maker once wrote Garbo Talks, a pointed comparison for just as Greta Garbo spoke after years of silence, George too had finally found his own voice after living far too long in the towering shadow of Lennon-McCartney. The album was not only celebrated by critics, but also achieved multiple gold records, shattering sales expectations by outselling both John Lennon's Imagine and Paul McCartney's Band on the Run. It was an explosion that made clear George was no longer a figure in the background, but an artist capable of reshaping the course of rock music in the early 1970s. Yet George's journey did not stop at music. In 1971, together with his close friend Ravi Shankar, he organized the Concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden. The event brought together some of the biggest names of the time, including Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and Ringo Starr, and is regarded as the first major charity concert in the history of rock. The concert for Bangladesh went on to inspire later iconic global events such as Live Aid. Throughout the 1970s, George continued to explore numerous musical projects. Albums like Living in the Material World 1973 and 33 and One of Three 1976 demonstrated his persistence and dedication to staying true to his unique style, a seamless blend of rock pop and Eastern influences. While not every release achieved towering commercial success, these works deeply reflected George's philosophy of life and spiritual depth qualities that set him apart completely from his former bandmates in the Beatles. George's influence also extended beyond music into the world of cinema. In 1978, he founded Handmade Films, a decision regarded as an act that saved British cinema. When the project Monty Python's Life of Brian was on the verge of collapse due to lack of funding, George mortgaged his personal assets to ensure its completion. Thanks to him, that classic film, along with many other independent productions, such as Time Bandits and Withnail, and I, reached audiences around the world. Despite the many ups and downs of his career, George Harrison maintained the image of a modest and introspective artist. He disliked the noise and glamour of show business, rarely attending glitzy parties. Instead, George spent much of his time with his family planting trees and tending the expansive gardens of his Friar Park estate, a place he treated as a spiritual sanctuary where he could seek peace within himself. His son, Donnie Harrison, once recalled that as a child, he even mistook his father for a gardener because George would often wear work clothes and spend long hours under the sun caring for each plant. That image, simple and genuine, perfectly captured the essence of George Harrison, a musical genius, a quiet humanitarian, but above all, a man who cherished serenity and sought harmony with the world. In 1999, George was attacked in his own home by an intruder and nearly lost his life. By 2001, he passed away from lung cancer at the age of 58. Friends and family recounted that in his final moments, George departed in tranquility, surrounded by music and the breath of meditation, in perfect alignment with the spiritual path he had chosen throughout his life. Unlike George, the breakup of the Beatles in 1970 drove Paul McCartney into the depths of despair. While his bandmates gradually found their own paths, Paul felt as if the entire world had collapsed beneath his feet. He withdrew to a remote farm in Scotland, living in isolation and depression, at times even believing that his music career had truly come to an end. During that dark period, one woman became his steadfast anchor, Linda Eastman. Linda was not only his wife, but also his partner in life, his colleague, and the guiding light that led him back to music. Together they formed the band Wings, with Linda on keyboards, standing by his side through every step of the journey. Under Paul's leadership, Wings not only succeeded, but rose to become one of the biggest bands of the 1970s. They produced a string of chart-topping hits, including Band on the Run Live and Let Die and Mull of Kintyre. It was Wings that helped Paul step out from the enormous shadow of the Beatles and solidify his status as an immortal legend. Even after Wings disbanded, Paul's glorious career continued to shine. He captivated audiences with solo hits such as Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, and Coming Up. His collaborations with other major artists also created historic moments, most notably Ebony and Ivory with Stevie Wonder and Say 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 with Michael Jackson. Beyond music, Paul McCartney became a dedicated social activist. He took part in many international charity campaigns, from advocating for animal rights and opposing landmines to promoting vegetarianism and supporting music education. His tireless contributions earned him countless prestigious awards, including 18 Grammy Awards and 2 inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. As of 2024, with an estimated fortune of $1 billion, Paul McCartney is not only one of the greatest musicians of all time, but also one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. However, even a legend cannot escape loss and hardship. His marriage of over 30 years with Linda came to an end in 1998 when she passed away from breast cancer. The loss of the love of his life devastated Paul, causing him to withdraw once again from the spotlight. Later, he entered into a turbulent marriage with former model Heather Mills. They wed in 2002, but the relationship soon turned into a nightmare. Their 2008 divorce became a bitter and costly legal battle that drew the attention of the entire world. After 2 stormy marriages, Paul McCartney finally found peace with Nancy Shevell, a businesswoman. They married in 2011 in a simple ceremony in London, reflecting the warmth, intimacy, and sincerity that Paul had always valued. With Nancy, he seemed to return to being a normal man. Her love helped heal the emotional scars that had built up over decades, from the loss of his mother in his youth to Linda's passing as his great partner in both life and creativity, to the personal and public crises that followed. It can be said that Paul McCartney's life is a journey that encompasses the full range of human emotions, from the depths of despair to the heights of triumph, from radiant happiness to immeasurable loss, from turbulent storms to the eventual discovery of a peaceful harbor. He is not only a musical legend on stage, but also an extraordinary human being in real life, a man who lived fully loved, deeply, and courageously overcame every challenge. If the stories you have just heard still leave you unsettled, don't hesitate to leave a few words of your thoughts below. Make sure to hit like, share this video with those who are also yearning for answers, and remember to follow the channel, because behind it all, countless untold secrets are still waiting to be revealed. Because hidden behind the dazzling stage lights, beyond the seemingly perfect smiles and the endless cheers, a legend is not built solely from the glory of victory. It is also etched by the cracks no one ever sees, the pains kept hidden away, and the silent battles that only they themselves could ever truly understand. There are truths that have never been disclosed, buried beneath a glittering facade. Sometimes just the smallest fracture is enough to make them erupt, shaking the entire world. And who knows? Perhaps everything you have just heard is only the visible tip of the iceberg, while the submerged part, darker and far more ferocious, is still quietly waiting for the day it will finally be exposed.